Welcome back to New Rockstars. I'm Erik Voss, and this is a breakdown of Severance Season 2, Episode 4, Woes Hollow. And I just realized that the term Woes Hollow is kind of a phonetic palindrome. What is happening here? Anyway, the Innies have finally gotten out, but into what? I think I have a decent idea of what the hell is going on in this amazing episode, or maybe I'm just feeling overconfident after our interpretation was correct that the Helly we've been seeing all season is actually the Audi Helena Eagen. But let's break down this fourth episode scene by scene for all the clues and amazing details that you might have missed. We open on Irving standing on a frozen over lake wearing a Russian fur hat and a fur coat. We zolly in on his face, so this means that this is a moment the Innie Irving was activated after maybe his Audi moved to this location, or his Innie was moved somewhere else. We see his tiny form as just a speck on a vast sheet of white ice, recalling the opening shot of Cobell's car at the beginning of episode 3. Now, all of this was shot at New York's Minnewaska State Park Preserve. Lake Minnewaska can freeze over like this in the winter, and the cliff that they stand on seems to be the Sam's Point area, but it is highly doubtful that they actually would have had John Turturro standing on this ice. No way production or his team or anybody would have approved that, or even park rangers would have allowed it. So they likely used these shots as just slates and then shot some close-ups of John Turturro elsewhere and then VFX'd them in. But we open on Irving, of course, to set up how this episode will end with this Innie's apparent execution. So we really open this episode in blinding white and we end this episode in complete blackness for him. Episode 3 ended with Audi Mark beginning his trippy reintegration procedure, so opening on Irving in the middle of a cold company outing is not at all where many of us expected episode 4 would begin. But I just love this curveball, because by starting in Irving's point of view, we know that a lot of what we see in this episode is not fully Mark's reintegrating mind, but something else that all 4 of these Innies are going through together. So really, the question we have for this episode is this a legitimate outdoor wilderness that the Audis were brought to before this? Or is this some kind of simulated environment that Lumen constructed, like the Danger Room for the X-Men? We should remember that the last moment we saw Irving in episode 3, he was asking Felicia in Optics and Design about the exports hall.
Do you remember where it is?
And then episode 3 never returned to Irving after that. So sure, maybe more time has passed since episode 3 than we thought, and this is some post-Mark reintegration ORTBO work trip. Or we could be picking up shortly after Irving asked Felicia where the exports hall is, and she told him, and then he took that elevator down to here, to a deeper floor beneath Lumen where they can simulate these outdoor environments. There are various examples throughout this episode that indicate that this is not a real outdoor national park preserve. I'm gonna point those out, but we can at least acknowledge that it is equally insane that Lumen would own thousands of acres of land that they could have transported the Audis to and then set up all these weird things for them to find, as it is that Lumen would have the technology to simulate that to lifelike verisimilitude, given how lo-fi and handcrafted their audiovisual media has been up until this point. Irving asks Mark if he woke up on the ice too, and Mark says yes, while Helena and Dylan seem to have started on the cliff. The fact that they all started out physically apart from each other, just spawning in this moment, is to me another clue that this could just be a simulated reality. Like, how could Lumen have practically gotten all the Audis to these spots and gotten them dressed like this without them asking questions? We should also remember that the Audi Irving bailiff was a sailor in the US Navy, as was his father, and Irving has a pet dog named Radar. So with him being on the ice like this, I kind of wonder if he or his father might have served on board a US Navy submarine during the Cold War, one of the subs that went beneath Arctic ice. Like, the costume design choice of Russian hats just has me thinking that the Russians in the Cold War could be connected somehow. Dylan reacts to being in an environment that doesn't have a ceiling. Since this is the first time that, well, 3 of these people have seen the daytime sky, maybe we, the audience, are seeing this atmosphere from their naive and impressionable point of view, and we, the audience, just kind of see it as authentically as their naivete makes it feel for them. Kind of like in Plato's allegory of the cave, we might be seeing the shadows on the cave wall as these lifelike realistic visuals, because that's the only form of reality the prisoners know. I kind of think Plato's allegory of the cave is kind of part of the inspiration, considering the credits called those figures the shadow versions of them. On the neighboring cliff is a TV set playing an electronic version of the Kier hymn. Remember, we heard Harmony sing this back in season 1, episode 6.
Kier, chosen one, Kier. Kier, brilliant one, Kier.
Now, you may remember how melodically that hymn was very odd, as it's mostly in G major, sounding positive and praiseful as church songs you hear often sound, but then it just drops suddenly to D sharp and ends in E minor, which is probably the glummest and most fatalistic of the chords.
Progress, knowledge, show no fear. Here, chosen one,
And yes, this episode will bring the bounty to the plane through the torment in the rains. But this is a DVD menu screen showing a digital rendering of the painting Keir invites you to drink of his water. Some of you pointed out how those lakes in that painting somewhat resemble the shape of the Great Lakes around the state of Michigan. And you know what? I did have the same thought, but I took it out of the script because I figured a lot of you would yell at me, pointing out that there is no cliff high enough to see the Great Lakes from such a vantage point. But I agree, they do match that shape. Then they watch a recording of Milchick.
Good morning, refiners. This is Mr. Milchick from work.
Yeah, there's a weird little glitch there suggesting that they spliced a lot of different takes together. The whole recording is full of these. Milchick explains how this is an ORTBO, outdoor retreat and team building occurrence. Yes, occurrence is an awkward word to force in there, but the acronym is actually an anagram for robot. Like if this is an artificial danger room environment, ORTBO equals robot could be a clue that all of the shadow Innies are in fact robots, kind of like how the danger room will use training sentinels. Milchick tells them that they are in Dieter Eagan National Forest. Now, think about that. National Forest? How vast would Keir PE have to be if this is true? And if the Eagans had another family member famous enough to name a national forest after, wouldn't Dylan have heard of him? Milchick's recording, though, anticipates Dylan's question and references a fourth appendix that Keir had dictated, this sacred fourth appendix, one that is forbidden on the severed floor. So if you think about this within Lumen doctrine, it's kind of similar to how Mormons believe the Book of Mormon is an additional testament of Jesus Christ that belongs with the Old and New Testaments. Now, to be clear, I'm not singling you out, Mormons. There are a lot of American institutions that went into inspiring Lumen's culture and its history, from Disney to Coca-Cola to Ford to, hey, even Apple. Milchick sets the challenge.
It's waiting for you in Scissor Cave. The very same grotto where Keir Eagan tamed the four tempers for the very first time.
Yeah, that punch-in on Milchick feels like an escape room task. He warns, stray not from Keir's path, lest you roil nature's wrath. And that whole idea of nature reclaiming you for your wanton behavior ends up becoming an important theme, as this is all kind of a cautionary tale from the character of Dieter Eagan and things that he does with idle hands. On another clip, they see this figure that resembles Mark creepily pointing their path. This episode's credits call this figure Shadow Mark and refer to the other three we see as Shadow Helly, Shadow Irving, and Shadow Dylan. Adam Jepson plays Shadow Mark, and on this actor's IMDb, he confirms that he also played Man in Hallway in season 2, episode 1. So that's confirmed. The figure behind Mark in that episode is this same figure. And since this thing appeared both on the severed floor and wherever this is, that to me is another clue that this environment could be within the Lumen facility. Based on Shadow Mark's indoor work attire and the fact that he has clearly been CGI'd into the shot based on where his feet meet the snow, these shadow figures do not look like they are actually standing in an outdoor snowy environment. I think they are ORTBO robots, and this whole floor might even be called the Shadow. Also, another lost parallel here, Shadow Mark looks an awful lot like the ghostly form of Jack Shephard's dead father, Christian Shephard, that guided him around the island in the season 1 episode called White Rabbit. And White Rabbit, in addition to being a Lewis Carroll reference, also the type of car Harmony Cobell drives. Now, there's an interesting transition here where the sun is behind the clouds, and then that sun does not reposition in the frame as we cross-dissolve to this lower shot from the trees. In the Truman Show, in the town of Sea Haven, that had an artificial sun and moon that could be placed in fixed positions in the artificial sky based on what production needed. Just another possible clue that this environment could be simulated. The Shadow Helly now appears, resting her hand on her hip and pointing them again to the right. I don't know if this pose is meant to reflect Helly's blasé attitude, or if these could be like escape room employees who are just bored watching you wander around and then begrudgingly point you to the next hint. They enter Scissor Cave, which is a crevasse at sharp diagonal angles that look like the angles of scissor blades, I suppose, and then placed like an object in a video game or in an escape room, the fourth appendix, a reddish book with a Roman numeral 4. And naturally, fourth appendix, this is the fourth episode. It reads like a dramatic first-person novel with an extravagant chapter 1. In this text, I was not born into this world alone. The lodgings of my mother's womb I shared with another, a twin brother who was named Dieter. In infancy, he was my bosom friend, but as we blossomed into boyhood, he beseeched me to take to the wood with him to live as paupers. My love for my twin unbalancing my judgment, I acceded, and we ventured into the wood towards page turn, Woes Hollow. Yeah, just 4 sentences on a single page and laying it out so that the reveal of the location name and episode title is delayed by a page break? Yeah, seems to be intentionally dramatic. And yes, a secret twin brother, a classic pulpy trope from Bart Simpson's twin brother in Treehouse of Horrors, named Hugo, who lived in the attic. Charles Xavier had a twin, Mumudrai, who tried to kill him in the womb and later came back as Cassandra Nova. Tony Stark had a brother in an iron lung named Arno Stark. In real life, Walt Disney's brother, Roy Disney, co-founded the company with him and served various executive roles over the years. And following Walt's death, Roy oversaw the completion of Disney's Orlando Park and Resort and had a pretty big impact on Epcot being what it is. So yes, this whole idea of the company founder having some brother figure is all over the place in real and fictional history. But we don't know if Dieter Eagan ever actually existed in the real world of the series, or if maybe Dieter Eagan is just some fiction conceived as like a non-canonical legend within the lore, designed as just this motivation tool for these Innies on their ORTBOs. Also included in this book is a map to Woes Hollow, which is like a Dora the Explorer-esque storybook map that winds through these enlarged visual landmarks toward this frozen waterfall. Irving continues to read, and a new recorded voice takes over for him.
Once concealed by Flora, my brother unfastened himself. The din of his fervor fell strangely into concert with the music of the wood.
So Keir Eagan has always been credited to actor Mark Geller, but it's believed that the voice of Keir Eagan is that of Ben Stiller himself. But it's interesting to even be hearing any recording of Keir dictating this 4th Appendix passage, since it would have been a secret 4th Testament. But this dictation would, I suppose, have been the one that Milchick referred to, and that might be why Keir sounds so croaky and like he's on his deathbed. Irving reads how Dieter became an instrument of nature and then ultimately spilt his lineage upon the soil. Think about that. Spilt his lineage. Yep, we later learned that is exactly what it sounds like it means, but we'll get to that later. The shadow Dylan points them again to their right. So this shadow form we actually see much closer to realize this is not Zach Cherry. This is actually actor Matthew LaBanca. But assuming it was 4 shadows in total, all pointing them to the right, there's a chance that this group just went in a big circle, which would make it easier if this really were a large artificial environment in a limited space. Irving looks ahead to Mark and Helena chatting and further suspects that Helly is just off. The real Helly would be far less accepting of whatever they're going through. He brings this up to Mark, but then they come upon a dead seal.
Why does it look so messed up?
It's just kind of interesting how this bird takes off from the branch right on her line. Now, seals are more commonly seen in saltwater and brackish water environments, but there are instances of seals swimming into freshwater bodies in pursuit of prey. You probably wouldn't see seals this far up a mountainous wooded freshwater stream that's probably landlocked. So could this be like a design glitch in this artificial reality? Is the corpse actually a stand-in for something else? Or is this some element from Cold Harbor, as harbors are typically where you would see seals? And the shot of the seal as they leave looks like the thing has been gored out by a larger predator, like, oh, I don't know, seals' natural predators, the polar bear? I wouldn't put past these lost loving writers to make that the case. Irving proposes to eat the seal, and Mark says that he knows Irv had a bad experience on the outside, which takes Irv back.
Who said I had a bad experience? What did you tell him, dumbass? Nothing! What the f?
Aha! This is why I think this is all after Mark's reintegration procedure began, because Innie Mark never got any context for what Irving went through on the outside. Only Outie Mark had that chat with Milchick, so Mark in this episode must have the memories of both his Innie and his Outie, and that puts everything Mark does and says in this episode in a new context of someone having reintegrated but hiding it, mostly pretty well from the others. February is a month all about love, and sure, for a lot of people that means showing appreciation for their significant other, but if you're a music lover, then to truly show appreciation, you'll need a pair of Raycon's new headphones. We fell in love with Raycon because of their earbuds, but their new everyday headphones are really fantastic. They've got a 40-hour battery life, so a single charge is enough to get you through a full work week, no matter how many meetings you've got. And if you forget to charge them, a quick 15-minute sip will get you 2 hours of battery life. Plus, they're super comfortable, and they come with active noise cancellation isolation, which I love. We have an open office here at New Rockstars, and having my Raycons on just really helps me tune out everybody else's chatter so I can focus on what I'm doing. Go to buyraycon.com/newrockstars20, where all headphones are 20% off. That's right, all headphones are 20% off on Raycon's website when you go to buyraycon.com/newrockstars20. Thanks again to Raycon for sponsoring us. So they find the water mall on the map. It looks like they shot this at Awasteen Falls in Minnewaska State Park. And at the top of it are their 4 shadow selves. Milchick appears in white outerwear, looking good. And he confirms Dylan's theory from earlier that the shadows are meant to be Dieter twins for each of them. Lumen, I guess, does want everyone to see themselves in Kier, but he follows it up with this.
This is the tallest waterfall on the planet.
No, it isn't. Angel Falls in Venezuela is the tallest waterfall on Earth, 3,212 feet or 979 meters. Awasteen Falls is only 70 feet. So it's just interesting that they would claim this to the Innies despite showing them a giant globe full of countries like Venezuela in that stop motion animation video. But at the end of the day, the Innies know really nothing about the outside world. It's just a weird thing to lie about. They follow Milchick to camp, and I don't know if it's a sped up transition, but the sun drops rapidly in the sky in the shot. Miss Huang is at camp roasting meat on a spit while Milchick points out tents in what he calls MDR blue and a washroom with 4-ply tissue, also torches.
Which can provide both a heat and a light source.
It's beautiful.
So it isn't stated, but this might be the first time the Innies have perceived fire, let alone wielded it as a tool. Therefore, we could see Milchick handing this torch to Mark as a Promethean gesture. Helena tries to make peace with Irv by giving him a snow seal.
In case you were hungry.
Helena's sense of humor is pretty forced here. No kidding, Irving sees through it. Also, how would one go about molding a snowball into a seal shape well enough that it looks like a seal and holds together like that? Irving gives Helena another chance to say what she saw during the overtime contingency, and Helena doesn't budge.
Irving. Okay.
Did you catch that? Britt Lauer lowers her voice to this dead serious whisper, similar to the tone Helena used with Harmony.
We fear no one.
And then she narrows her eyes just a little, revealing her contempt. Milchick referred to a campfire recital earlier, and now we see that recital as Miss Huang plays the theremin, the creepiest instrument that I thought had to be plugged in, as Milchick reads more of the 4th appendix. Dieter lay unwashed in his bedroll, though the Hollows pool was primed for bathing. We ate of the hair we'd caught and told each other rhyming jokes till our gullets ached. But at last, the thought tickling my mouth emerged. We must return to father, I said, but I promised to look after you in the ether mill. When at last a sound came from him, it was a bewailing whimper. We believed, I suppose, that we'd be woodland poppers forever. Now, a couple things I want to point out there. Ether mill? In the courtship painting, didn't he seem to be stirring a big vat of ether? And that's how the Eagans started their prosperous business. And also, who was the father that never gets included in the Eagan family lore? But at this point in the story, you hear Miss Huang's theremin notes dipping lower to doom tones as Milchick makes a sudden shift into body horror.
I was looking at him when his eye came out. It popped from the socket, driven by a sudden torrent of pus from his skull.
So Milchick continues to read how Dieter's hair tore away like moss and his pus thickened into sap. So this transition, whether literal or figurative or both, is what the words were referring to by spilled his lineage into the soil. This legend is suggesting that Dieter lived off the land as kind of a prodigal pauper for just too long that nature literally claimed him and turned him into a tree via this violent process. Now there are various Greek mythological stories of mortals being punished by being turned into trees, but there's like a cautionary tale here, warning against a non-industrious life, a goofus and gallant story, if you will. Idle hands are the devil's plaything, and literally, what do idle hands sometimes do? It kind of feels like this is how a capitalist yuppie would interpret the story of Chris McCandless, aka Alexander Supertramp, right? It's like Kier Eagan is saying, those who reject hard worth and loaf about and do other things are doomed to be claimed by the earth, but follow in my path and unlock a Promethean technological fire of eternal life. And not only does this underscore what we suspect Lumen is trying to do by literally reincarnating and resurrecting Kier Eagan, this whole philosophy really comes from what German historian Max Weber called the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, writing in his 1904 text how capitalism flourished in the industrial world by coming out of a New Age Protestant culture, stepping away from Catholicism that conditioned the working class into materialist thinking, that if we can be profitable in our lifetimes, that is a sign that we are the blessed people destined for heaven. So work, 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 work. And we can see how that parallels a lot of the American mythos and and culture that seem to be embodied in extreme forms in Lumen on this show. But now the Dieter legend shifts into a ghost story as Kier recounts how he walked toward the waterfall to drown out his brother's screams. This is where he first encountered woe, and a reminder that woe is one of the 4 tempers: woe, frolic, dread, and malice. And a side note that I'm now just realizing, assuming Kier and Dieter were engaging in frolic moments earlier, and since Helena points out that spilt his lineage means Dieter was masturbating, does that add a gross context to Mr. Drummond tattooing frolic on this part of his hand? I'm sorry to put that thought in your head, but I think that's what the show is saying. But woe is described as a gaunt bride, half the height of a natural woman, and Milchick shows an illustration of woe standing before the waterfall. The idea that it wasn't Kier letting this happen to his brother that invoked woe, but rather his attempt to drown out his brother's screams and the feeling he felt from that, tells us that Lumen wants us to think that woe comes not from our own actions, but comes from our own feelings of empathy, that you should feel nothing if someone in your life suffers due to their reckless behavior. And that, in a way, is even more insidious. Milchick then reads woe's warning.
This is your doing. You suffered his wantonness. Now he's no one's brother. Only chaos's whore.
And notice how Milchick isn't even looking down to read it. He is reciting this from memory. Milchick says that the next chapter is Kier and the thieving nanny. And we can only imagine what virtue that story is going to be teaching. Maybe something like, when these outside caregivers provide you with real nurturing love and tell you that you're living in an abusive cult environment, they're probably just stealing mother's pearls. So snitch, child, snitch. Helena breaks into laughter over the Dieter story as a warning about idle hands, and gets some laughs from Mark and from Dylan. And to punish their immaturity, Milchick tells Miss Huang to throw the marshmallows in the fire. But were these actual marshmallows? Because these things are an unnatural cubic shape with Kier's face printed on them. And we get this close-up of Kier's face burning. And in a way, just the dark bubbles coming out of it, doesn't that kind of seem like what happened to Dieter being turned into this like bark-like texture? Irving presses Helly again on her Night Gardener bullshit story, and Helena cruelly presses back on saying Irving never got to see Bert when he was lonely. Helena feels guilty for coming on too strong and tells Mark after the fact,
Sorry if I'm distracting you from
what?
I'm looking for your wife.
She was about to say, sorry I distracted you from completing the Cold Harbor file. Mark and Helena's goo-goo eyes turn into heavy kissing, and they strip down and we see that they are wearing matching long johns underneath. I just found that to be an interesting detail. Irving takes his torch out to the woods, and there's another creepy transition as Mark and Helena's orange-lit hands crawl out over him in the frame, the editing implying that Mark and Helena's fornication might be what caused Irving to trip in the snow and his torch to go out. Irving rests in the cold and watches as the clouds cover the moon. Meanwhile, Helena admits,
Like who I was on the outside.
Who were you?
Who were you? Another form of Mark's very first words to Helly, the opening lines of the series, who are you? And then Mark rolls over and kisses her, and then in an incredible transition, the back of his head crosses frame and switch, it's now Gemma. And we flicker back and forth briefly between Gemma and Helena. We are seeing a side effect of Mark's reintegration. He mostly has control over what Dr. Ragabi did to him, but his reality switches on occasion. And this recalls the imagery that we saw in the new season 2 intro sequence that often shows Helly and Gemma as like parallel Persephones lost in Mark's subconscious. And something to note though, if Mark has been reintegrated with Innie and Audi back as one, it would confirm to us that Helena Eagan is not enough of a public figure for Audi Mark to know who she is. Like, remember, he nearly ran over her in the parking lot in the pilot episode, but in that moment, there was no indication that he knew she was like a famous heiress to the company. So based on that, her event in the season 1 finale was Helena Eagan's public coming out party. Like, they might have known her name, but not what she looked like. And since Lumen did contain the media after that, maybe Audi Mark still in this moment doesn't know who Helena Eagan is, or at least what she looks like. We now transition to Irv in a section of the woods where all the trees now look bare and burnt, like it could be after a fire or an eruption. He wakes up back in his Innie workplace attire and wanders back to the MDR cubicle grid in the middle of this brush. His screen is illuminated, but instead of like a black background with white text, now it is white with black text as moths buzz around the screen. Now the file in progress on his screen is Montauk, which is a coastal point in New York's Hamptons, known for a picturesque lighthouse. Remember, Mark Mark's file is Cold Harbor. Helena's file was Santa Mira, which is the island town and invasion of the Body Snatchers. So all three of these are coastal locations. Maybe the idea is that each file represents like an open gulf to the abyss of the subconscious that they have to order in some way. But Bert lowers the wall across from him. And then in the caddy corner position, the position Irving was, from Helly's perspective, is Woe. Woe is played by Faith Vaughn. When we cut to Woe's point of view from her workspace on her computer is also the Montauk file, and she has this terrifying glitchy movement, and we hear her continue to type even when her fingers are no longer moving. Irving looks back at his screen, and now we only see the numbers of 1, 4, 5, and 7 swirling around. I was trying to do some numerology to figure out what those are about. But then when we come back to it, we see random numbers, but the letters A, E, G, and N floating around, and they seem to be forming the shape of an I. Now, A, G, E, and N, if you repeat the A, you do get Eagen, but then Woe jump scares us by appearing at Irving's side, and then Irving wakes up from the nightmare. So, from all of this, is Woe just a manifestation of Irving's unrequited love for Bert? Or is it that plus his envy for the goo-goo eyes between Helena and Mark that he left behind? It just kind of seemed like Irving's march into the woods to drown out those behind him as they were involved in some kind of perverse sexual act just feels like a recreation of Kier's turn toward the waterfall to drown out his handsy brothers wailing. Irving wakes up the next morning. The fact that Irv did not die of hypothermia overnight, even with the coat on, is just, I think, another clue that this might not be a true outdoor climate. Helena goes back to the waterfall and Irving appears behind her, framed in the gap between the trees, and he asks,
What are you doing down here?
Of course, he's referring to the waterfall, but also down here, as in the severed floor. And down here, again, is it just possible that Woe's Hollow, this whole ORTBO, is like a lower level compared to the severed floor? Irv's certainty comes from how cruel Helena was to him the night before, meanness that Helly R never would have showed. Irving tries to drown Helena, who he calls an outie, a mole. And because he deduced that the only person at Lumen powerful enough to even voluntarily send an outie to the severed floor would have to be a member of the family, so Irving's able to figure that out too. Helena screams, God damn it, Seth, do it! Accidentally telling Milchick's first name to all of them, and Irving threatens Seth by saying, yes, Seth, do it, and Milchick radios in to remove the Glasgow block. So the Glasgow block, let's try to unpack that. Glasgow, of course, the city in Scotland. There was a term called the Glasgow effect that has now been, considered contested, offensive to Scots, so we try not to use it anymore, but there was a time when Glasgow effect would refer to a lower life expectancy of residents of Glasgow and of Scotland compared to the rest of the UK. I don't know if the term Glasgow block is connected to that, but for Lumen to even have a term for this suggests that they have done this before to others, to allow an outie to be muted to the triggers that would normally cause the transition to the Innie. I pointed out last week that we did not hear the ding when Helena went down the elevator. And yes, there have been several other behavioral clues that we picked up on, but now we do hear the ding and she's not in the elevator. We get the Zolly effect on Helly's face as she's underwater. And now for the first time this season, we have Helly R officially back. And this poor woman, for her seconds ago, she was shouting, I'm a prisoner to the Lumen investors. And seconds later, she wakes up nearly drowning to death in a freezing pond. Milchick throws the book at Irving, ordering him to be permanently dismissed. Dylan apologizes, saying he should have believed him, and Irving says,
It's all okay. Just remember, hang in there.
I remember there was a similar quote on the poster in the new break room in episode 1. Milchick tells Irving to walk into the forest, kind of like a form of banishment, as if something you would say to someone walking out on thin ice, like where he began this episode. Milchick continues to sentence him, saying his workspace and his relationships will be purged, and it will be as if he never drew a breath on this earth.
May Kier's mercy follow you into the eternal dark.
And we end with a close-up on Irving as he calmly closes his eyes, and the world around him, not his face, but the world around him, retracts in the classic dolly zoom. So if Helena Eagan was truly in danger of drowning, there must be some body of water that Irving actually stuck her face into. Could it have been like a tank for pineapple bobbing? I have no idea. All my takes that Woe's Hollow was a danger room simulation can be disproven by plenty of evidence in this episode, but I also think it's equally absurd for this to be an actual outdoor park that exists in the real world somewhere of the show. I'm confused, but I still have nothing for this series but goo-goo eyes. Comment down below with your thoughts on this episode. Follow me at Erik Voss. Subscribe to all the channels in the new Rockstars network for breakdowns and news coverage of everything you love. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.